5, where we are looking at the continuing relevance of Lewis, or sort of why we are all in class about him, and seeing that now. So we're going to be looking at 2 assignments, and you're going to get to choose in your final paper out of 3 topics. So let's start to get the idea for this one. First off, Carrigan talks about how Lewis shares a death date with 2 other people, President John F. Kennedy and Aldous Huxley, and then makes a sort of strange comment that I find problematic because she describes Huxley as now largely forgotten. And I find that really surprising because that's not true. But perhaps if you're looking at larger figures like how many books are sold, Huxley doesn't have a ton of books, and so even if he sold like 2 or 3 of those in huge numbers, it would be hard to match the quantity of Lewis. But anyway, we end up with strange bedfellows, don't we, when we look at how our lives coincide with other people on the planet. A very wide selection of people with JFK and Huxley and Lewis all sort of together because of one quirk or twist of fate or moment in time. But the key element is down here. Over 50 years after his death, Lewis is still able to impact and influence many. And we are also going to look at the idea that Lewis talks about, that really the only way to judge someone's work is time, which I think is really interesting because I tend to read things like Marcus Aurelius talking about life lessons. And there's just no way that he could have pictured people reading his work 2,000 years later. So I hope that Lewis has the same good fortune and that his work still reaches so many people. So our topics this week are discussing that relevance of Lewis today in light of his continued impact, and consider some specific aspects of his writing, which is really cool because a lot of writers tend to write one thing. They are good at fiction, or they're good at nonfiction, or they write academic work. Finding a person who really just pushes themselves to write everything and does that well is really, really hard. I mean, it's a jack of all trades sort of thing, and becoming master at multiples is really, really tricky. So he has academic nonfiction, he has nonfiction, he has apologetics, he has fiction for both children and adults. And of course, you can see that some of these have varying levels of success. So his adult science fiction is less well known than his children's fantasy. But I would argue that it's still some pretty good writing, some interesting works. Not sort of the best in the world for science fiction, but a really good foray. I find that not a lot of people have read them, so I pushed myself there years ago. So this week for our readings, we're mainly looking at Hanbury's article about why C.S. Lewis never goes out of style, and then of course chapter 15 of McGrath, whom we have been enjoying over many times. So our discussion, everyone's been doing great at this. I just like to mention it a couple of times just to remind you, don't ever forget that the discussion posts tend to need 2 peer responses, so always check that when you're looking at the grading criteria so that you are on track, just in case, because like our discussion this week with our group projects had 4, so make sure you're watching those kinds of things. And then we're going to look at a paper as well. So in our discussion, we are looking at this question that McGrath poses. So how are we to judge Lewis 50 years after his death? Lewis himself had no doubt about the identity of the judge or the criterion to be used in such an assessment. For Lewis, the only reliable critic of a writer's value is time, and the only reliable measure is the enjoyment that results from reading that writer's works. I mean, how exciting is that to think about? So, given what we have learned thus far in this class, discuss your perception of the legacy of Lewis, specifically addressing how Lewis's writings have impacted your own life. Don't forget the specific examples. It's a great way to let us all see sort of what you're thinking about and what has impacted you. And I just noticed that I ended up spacing this, so technically it's a block quote, and if it's a block quote, you're right, I did it wrong, and it should look like that. So I don't think it was originally a block quote, and I did the spacing, so I should have been paying attention. So there's your APA for the day. So I think this is a really open question. I hesitate to put any parameters for you. It's really about just saying, some things stand the test of time and some don't. And why does that happen? What goes on with that? Why are we still reading Shakespeare? Why does he still so heavily influence what stories are told? Why do some stories sort of become encapsulated in a specific time and place, and why do others not? And Lewis, you may have noticed already in looking at the movies versus the story and stuff like that with The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, that there are certain elements where you say, oh, that's part of his time and place. And then other things you're like, oh, that's not. So ask those kinds of questions and see what you find out about it. So final paper, the details are things like APA 7. Check the template in the student lounge or go to our connect on ccu.connect, I believe it is. 4 to 5 pages, so watch our YouTube video on that. Not every page counts, even though we count every page with our numbering system. Reference Lewis, so you're going to need at least one work in your paper. So you're going to reference at least one thing Lewis has written and one outside source. And we had a great question about this, and I think the Bible counts, because I think that if you are looking for a great quote to add, you are looking for good material that supports your ideas and your discussion. So if you find a great verse that does that, or you find a great article, maybe one of the works that we're reading this week, any of those things, I think they all count. So here are your topic choices. 1, you can look at the significance of reading Lewis's works in your faith journey. This idea is about being specific about a specific struggle in faith and how he has approached that, perhaps, or discusses it in a way that helps you. You may want to include some works that have been meaningful to you for that one. Or you could look at Mere Christianity, which should be italicized. An attempt to answer how this book might still be used today. So what made sense to you? You're reading it for class, but at the same time, would you recommend it to someone if they had certain questions or they wanted to know more about Christianity? So what was enlightening out of this text, both doctrinally, experientially, something that you feel impacted you and touched you? Or McGrath points out that some judged Lewis's move to writing fiction as an escape, that maybe, he'd bitten off more than he could chew and he was just going to go the easy route and write fiction, which I would say is absolutely ridiculous in terms of writing, because fiction is not super duper easy. You may think that the books are simple, but that's a really hard thing to do. So do you think that's accurate? Do you think he was escaping, that he was just like, you know what, I can't do that anymore? Or do you think maybe there are other reasons for why he did it or why he chose it? Give us some specific examples from McGrath, maybe from Lewis's own works, maybe from some examples in the Chronicles of Narnia. I think it's always really interesting because in the UK versions, I believe it's book 3 that becomes The Magician's Nephew, and that is autobiographical. So along this journey of writing about writing children's fiction, he forays into sort of rewriting his own story and making it have a good fairy tale ending. So I have the rest of the slides because I want to give you some ideas here that when we tackle these ideas, start looking for a way that you can turn it into your 5-paragraph paper. So ideally, for all of these, you will have your conclusion, you'll have your introduction, and of course that will have your thesis, and then you'll have 3 supporting points. So look for how you can, in your introduction, share a thesis that is going to give us a stance or an opinion, and that is going to then say because X, Y, and Z. And those are going to be your supporting points because you're previewing that for your reader. So in this case, talking about faith journey, you could say something like, Lewis influenced my faith journey by discussing whatever topic you want to bring up, and then talk about 3 ways in which that happened. So the same thing is going to happen for all of these. You're going to look for a way to write that 5-paragraph paper. It can change as you go along. Like maybe you find out you need 3 items, maybe 4, maybe 5. Things change and alter. But if you aim for this, it's a great way to keep a clean, sort of tidy paper that always answers what you want it to. And it's just a great sort of format to get yourself comfortable. And then the more comfortable you get with it, the more you can sort of toy with it and play with it and tease it. Think of them as building blocks. And the more comfortable you get with your building set, the more you know all the pieces and what those pieces do, the bigger and grander and more exciting the elements, the way you put all of that together works. So if we're looking at something like Mere Christianity, there are so many possibilities. I mean, we could talk about just the fact that it's a talk that he was giving and what that means, that having this on the radio, I mean, BBC4 is still that sort of thing. It's where people talk about what matters. A friend of mine, I need to listen, just did a segment herself that everyone was allowed to call in and talk about things about the pandemic that have impacted them, and to have 10 minutes to share what has happened to them. So this is still something BBC4 is really interested in sharing and exploring and getting people to talk about where they are, and in a way that helps everyone else. So even something as simple as that, as just this being on the radio, is a great part of discussion. And then from there, of course, you have the entire book. So everything that we read as a group, all of the chapters that we read individually. So there are lots of possibilities. So one way that you could do this is to have something about yourself, to have something about doctrine, and then something about experience. So you could sort of break it apart. So there are lots of different ways to think about that. Or you could say, you know what, I want to talk about experience. And so I want to talk about experience sort of like in terms of self. I want to talk about experience in terms of doctrine, and how like our own personal reactions shape that. And I want to talk about experience as sort of the human condition. So just one or two ideas could branch off into a lot of ways. So my final point on that is that as you're working through these and you're trying to think of sort of how it goes together, remember that that is what I'm here for, that I'm your sounding board and your friend and your teammate. So not only for this course, but any of them, when you are working on things like this and you're not quite sure where it goes, or that you're on the right track, or you just want someone else to sort of bounce ideas off of, send that to me. Send me the question. Send me where you're thinking about going with it, because this kind of thing, building questions, is what I do. And so I'm perfectly happy to help you. So explore, have fun, pick from these 3 topics, and decide where you want to go. And if you need any support, make sure you reach out and ask. So have a great week, and thank you for putting up with all my little notes and lectures and ideas. I'll see you later.